Hi Year 12, my name is Mrs. Reed and I am going to work through your Mod C Craft of Writing revision seminar today. Very importantly, it's always a very good place to start to reconsider your rubric. Ultimately, this is where we get all of our information from regarding your modules. So if you haven't already, go back and revisit your Module C rubric. Very quickly, I just want to go through a few key points just to draw your attention upon those. The first one is obviously the use of your Mod C prescribed texts for Module C writing. It's really important that you understand that they are to be used in this module as inspiration and models within your own writing. You're not supposed to quote from them, you're not supposed to analyse them. It's all just about using them as good examples of writing. So in your rubric, you'll see that they need to be the focus of your crafting of language. So you've got to have looked at how those writers use language creatively, how they're using it imaginatively, for a range of purposes. Maybe they're using their language to describe the world around them. Alternatively, maybe it's to evoke some sort of emotion or to shape a perspective, to share a vision. So that's what you've got to have clarity around regarding your Module C prescribed texts. Your teachers would have chosen at least 2 of those texts. Some classes have done more. My classes, for example, have studied 3 Mod C texts. So make sure you've got a good understanding of how those writers have used their language. The next thing is obviously to focus your attention upon your own use of language in Module C. So ultimately what NESA is requiring you as a HSC English student to understand across all of your modules is the importance of language, the power that language has to help us understand and to position us as responders. So instead of analysing someone else's text here in Mod C, you're actually required to explain your own writing of texts and your crafting as a writer. So it's really important to make sure you've thought thoroughly about your use of language. That's why it's really not a good idea just to write off the cuff in your HSC exam, because that will probably mean you don't really think about your language. You're just writing on a whim. It's all about this process of writing that hopefully you've engaged in as you've gone through the HSC journey with Mod C. You've got to understand that writers always are really intentional in their use of language. And lots of my students from time to time say, oh, miss, have they really thought about it in that much detail? Sometimes we probably go into an extreme kind of focal and analytical view of language, but ultimately, if you sit down to try and write a poem, you'll understand how difficult that is just to write on a whim. You've got to really think about your use of words and the way that you're crafting your structure. So that's the kind of process here that you need to have engaged in with your Mod C writing. Here, you're thinking about your purpose and your audience. So that's the use of the ape image there, audience, purpose, and then explaining the effect of your language. So this part of the rubric obviously gives you some really clear indication that in your Mod C writing, you need to be very clear in why you're writing. That's not just because it's your HSC and you're told to write. You've got to go a bit deeper than that as a writer, as a student writer here. You're really exploring why you want to write about this particular chosen idea or issue or topic or story. There's got to be a depth to your reasoning behind why you want to write this. Who are you writing it for? Think about your audience, because ultimately that should shape your language. If you're writing for children, that's going to be very different if you're writing for an adult audience, and the way that you structure your language should reflect that. Very importantly, again, you've got a list here by NESA of important language features that they want you conscious of in your Mod C. You can see those features there on the screen. It's imagery, rhetoric, voice, characterization, point of view, dialogue and tone. So they're the ones that out of all the features of language, they've chosen to extract here in your rubric. So be really conscious of those. If you're going to get a question directing you to respond to a feature of language, I would dare say it's probably likely to be one of those types of features. So just make sure you've consciously considered those in your writing. The next thing is obviously to understand the importance of this module in regards to a process. You should have engaged in that process, and part of that process is evolving your writing, improving your writing over time. So I really encourage you, if you haven't done that thoroughly, spend some time in the next few weeks before your HSC exams really trying to improve the process. So go back to your writing, craft it further, develop some of the language, look at your structure, edit it, make sure there's not silly things like mistakes in your spelling or in your grammar and your punctuation. That's what the markers are going to really sting here, because that reflects poor writing. So be conscious of that. Make sure you've gone and engaged in that process of writing and really improved as you've crafted. All right, so what can you do? This is normally the module that causes the most stress to our Year 12 students. And if I'm honest with you, it's often teachers that feel the most anxiety towards Module C2. We've got a lot of input, obviously, in shaping your understanding of the text in the other modules. We can give you really good textual insights and analysis, but here we've got a little less ability to really predict and guess what the question's going to ask you for Mod C. It's nearly impossible to try to have any sort of guess at what they're going to ask you for Mod C. So with that in mind, how can you then best prepare for Mod C for your HSC exams? The first thing I will be very clear in telling you, and what you should be doing, is practicing your writing. Now, I know lots of you as students, and particularly at this point in your HSC journeys, are really over it, but it's really important to understand that this is a craft, and the more times you're doing it, the better you're going to get at it. So I say to my classes, it's like if you're a soccer player. You might be a really good soccer player. You might be a professional soccer player, and you've spent hours training, kicking that dumb ball over and over and over again in drills, even as a professional. And it's the same, exactly the same if you're a musician. You spend hours upon hours practicing and playing your instrument. You're just doing it to get better and better and over again. Writing is a little bit like that, Year 12. And the more times you're practicing this process and you're practicing your writing, you're going to get better. So don't think that you can just lob up to the exam and write this brilliant piece of writing if you haven't practiced. So take it seriously. Focus upon what you do know for Module C. And I'm going to go through really quickly a few things that we do know about the Module C exam. The first thing is your criteria. It's always the same criteria that they're marking in the HSC response for Module C, and it's actually exactly the same as what advanced Module C students are being marked to, this criteria. 2 points, and I want you to see on the screen those 2 points. The first one is your crafting of language to address the demands of the question. The question is always very important. But it's the crafting of your language. And you'll see in the second dot point, the repetition of language here. Use language appropriate to audience, purpose, and context to deliberately shape meaning. What that should give you an insight into, Year 12, is how important your language is in Module C. Very significant that you've considered, you've crafted, and your focus is upon your language within your writing. We know that Paper 2 modules has the Module C question. It's a 20-mark question, but you need to understand that you could have a few variations, obviously, with this question. The first thing is it could be a one-part question, which means the expectation in that 40 minutes is that you'll write about 800 words. That seems to be the benchmark. It could include a stimulus. It might be a quote. It might be an image. You might be directed to be conscious of your Mod C writing, your Mod C texts, and using those to shape your writing. And obviously the other option could be, which is probably more common, though last year's was different, it could be a 2-part question for Module C, where you have to write something creatively, a composition, and then you may have to explain that writing. So that's that reflective style of writing. So if it's a 2-part question, what I want you conscious of is being aware of your marks. Make sure you understand you've got 40 minutes for Module C and you've got 20 marks, so 2 minutes per mark. That means if you've got a breakdown of a 12-mark composition and an 8-mark reflection, you're spending about 24 minutes working time on your composition and about 16 minutes on your reflection. So just be really careful with your timing. I know as teachers we say that all the time, but the amount of times we have students come out and say, "Miss, I didn't finish." And I'll be like, "Ah." So please be conscious, your timing is really important. As an aside, as markers, we've been told that in Module C, it's very common that the quality of the writing is more important than the quantity of your writing. What that should give you a focus in regards to is don't go like a bull at a gate. Don't just start writing and try to get as much as you can on the page without really consciously considering what you're crafting and how you're crafting it. So just have those things in mind. We know that in regards to this Mod C exam. What you do know is that you'll be given likely different styles of writing to focus upon within the Mod C exam. And you will have looked at these, I know, in your classes already, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going back over this. Persuasive writing is obviously one of those styles, and obviously the persuasive style of writing has come through our junior years. There's a great focus upon persuasive writing often in our NAPLAN, for example, as a junior. So it's coming back to see how you've got better at that style of writing as you're now a HSC student. So be conscious of that. You can see there on the screen a few elements of persuasive responses. Be conscious of those, and if you're directed to write persuasively, make sure you're doing that really strong persuading as a purpose within your writing. Discursive writing. Discursive writing causes a little bit more uncertainty in a lot of students. It does as well for teachers in a lot of cases, but the discursive writing is ultimately an exploration. You're discussing and exploring a topic and an issue. And again, there's something really free about discursive writing. Again, some of our students craft really excellent discursive pieces of writing. So just don't avoid discursive writing. It's a really beautiful kind of expression of your thinking and your experiences, and ultimately you might be directed towards discursive writing. Again, you've got a few more points in regards to what you need to be considerate of in your discursive writing. So if you want to have a, pause the video, have a read through some of those, I'll also send these slides to your teachers so that they can share those if you want to go back through any of these details that I'm going through. Imaginative writing, lots of students obviously with their Mod C focus upon the imaginative writing. I'll talk a little bit more about making wise choices as a student writer, but obviously imaginative writing most commonly is a narrative-based writing style that lots of students craft. It doesn't have to be a narrative piece of writing, and I draw your attention there on the screen to the definition by Nessa. It's simply a piece of creative writing. So don't fall into the trap of always assuming that imaginative writing is story-based, okay? It often is, but it doesn't have to be. So just be conscious again. A good element of language that is listed in your rubric for Mod C to focus upon here is imagery. Imagery is a really powerful and foundational aspect of imaginative writing. And often in writing, we see it connects to setting or place, engaging the reader through appealing to their senses, their visual, their auditory, their tactile, their kinesthetic, their movement. So all of those elements that you're engaging me in the way that you're crafting your imagery is really, again, something I want you conscious of as you're preparing those final Mod C writing pieces. Positioning them within your narrative world, perhaps, just really hooking them in as we're reading. You've got there some good examples of what you can do, and I love that example on the screen that talks about sometimes really good writing is thinking of creating a verbal cinema, so that you're actually trying to give me almost a filmic experience through your writing. You're describing details in an extreme close-up, and then you're kind of moving me back so that I see more of what you're describing. Again, it just engages me as a marker and as a responder because I'm really involved in what you're writing. So really think about that Year 12 as you're focusing on your imaginative. Obviously, characterization, particularly in narrative-based imaginative pieces. Characterization, again, is one of those features that Nessa has listed in your rubric. And the crafting of authentic, credible characters is really important in imaginative writing. The who of your pieces. And they need to be as authentic as possible. There's got to be a depth to them and a complexity to them. And ultimately, the more you've thought about your character and the more you've thought about that persona within your writing, ultimately that again is indicative of better writing. Often we see really shallow and superficial characters that students write, particularly if they're just writing off the cuff. Do your best to avoid those kind of stereotypical, cliched, kind of often teenagey, angsty kind of, characters. Try to go a little bit deeper in what you're crafting. Really think about these characters as having a life beyond your writing. So how can you imagine them in different places and in different experiences? You don't have to write all that, but if you've thought through that in your mind as a writer, it often adds greater depth and development to your writing. So really think about how they might react in different situations and experiences. That means that you might need to go beyond what you've crafted already and really think about them, okay? Give them a backstory, give them a past in your mind, and hopefully then as you're writing in your exam, you can tap into some of that. Obviously, this characterization element links to narrative, voice, and dialogue, which again are other features that Nessa lists in your Module C rubric. So think about who is telling your story. Are you going to position me within your character, or are you going to position me alongside them as a third person voice? Really consider those elements. And dialogue, be careful with your dialogue. We don't like dialogue overdrive where you're just using this kind of constant talking. Be selective with your dialogue. How are you going to drop in pieces? Maybe it's the inner dialogue. Someone's thinking internally, and it doesn't always have to be spoken dialogue. So again, think about those elements as you're continuing to craft your writing. Okay, so now what I really want to give you is just some really quick, easy strategies to hopefully help you as you're tweaking what you've written to adapt to some stimulus, perhaps. Students who tend to do well in these kind of exam-style timed responses are ones that have crafted writing, but are then able to adapt to really integrate whatever it is that they're given within a stimulus and a question. So some easy things to think about perhaps in your own planning and process. Think about gaps that maybe you can integrate into what you've already written, perhaps in maybe an imaginative piece. So maybe that's a central motif. Maybe there's something in the image or something in the quote that you can use as a motif for your writing that you keep recurring and you keep dropping in throughout what you've written. It doesn't mean you have to abandon what you've already crafted, but it's being strategic in dropping in something additional that you're given in the question. It could be a flashback perhaps. So maybe you're given an image where you've got a scene and you think in your mind immediately, oh, that's not going to work with what I've crafted. That's got nothing to do with what I've written as a narrative. Don't throw everything out the window. Just pause for a moment and start to process some of what I just mentioned about the character and the broader experiences beyond your story or your narrative. Think about perhaps a flashback. Could that situation or that scene work in the character's past? Maybe they've been there and now you're writing forward in time the rest of your narrative. Maybe alternatively it's somewhere they go in the future. So start to exist your character beyond just the scope of what you've written. Remembering the two M's is kind of a bit of a strategy here. Memories and motifs are really effective ways to integrate and interweave a stimulus. And keep testing your writing against different stimulus. That's a really important strategy at this point in time, Year 12, making sure you're exploring and experimenting with different stimulus to see how your writing is going to ultimately stand up but also adapt. Mood paragraphs, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the details of this. Some of you probably have already done some of these in your Mod C classes, but ultimately tone. Tone is another one of those features in the Mod C rubric. Tone is all about the mood and the atmosphere and the emotion that you're crafting through your writing and your language. So here, something really effective is just sitting down and writing some paragraphs that explore different moods or feelings. Again, don't overthink this. Don't try and fit it into a narrative or fit it into a piece of writing that you've already got. Just write for the sake of writing about that particular mood. And maybe it's something you're feeling at the moment. Maybe you're frustrated or really uncertain perhaps, or confused or worried, whatever it is that you're experiencing. Sorry, they were all negatives. They could be really positive, excited, optimistic, whatever it is. Focus on just trying to craft some of that in your language, in your writing, just small pieces. And again, what you can then hopefully do is maybe tap into some of that in your exam if you're given a tone focus in your direction for a question. Again, think about that as a little strategy just in preparing finally for your Mod C exam writing. Add some flair. Very importantly is that obviously, as we've talked about, the use of language. Trying to be really intentional in your language and do things a little bit outside of the box. Don't just write in that very clunky, bland style of language. This is where you're wanting to be a bit unique and a bit different in your Mod C. It's where you can stand yourself apart from the large mass of students that are writing for the HSC. Again, I've talked about the importance of imagery. Be very intentional in your use of imagery, and that's not just visual imagery. There's all different styles of imagery, which you should have explored as students in language. But ultimately, using the tactile, the sensory feel of things. Taste is less common, but the sounds of a particular experience. Similes, metaphors add depth, but don't use those really shallow ones. Again, think about meaningful uses of that figurative style of language. And figurative language is the non-literal, all right, where you're exploring, perhaps an emotion alongside, yesterday's big storm, and perhaps you're exploring the fear and the uncertainty of a character, and you're aligning it with a large storm. And that could represent, obviously, that inner uncertainty and that conflict, perhaps. So think about meaningful metaphors and meaningful comparisons through your language. Obviously, you've got very simple sonic devices, repetition, and all those sort of elements of language for a purpose and, again, a meaning in your writing. Rhetorical questions are great as an example. We don't want to see them in your essays. Don't ever use them in an essay. But in creative writing, they are so powerful. They hook us in. So think about them as a feature of language. And another really great one that I always try to get my students engaging with is varying your sentence, your syntax in writing. Long sentences and then short sentences, long descriptions alongside punchy little truncated or one-word statements, maybe one statement paragraphs, and they are so beautifully crafted within writing for a purpose. So think about those again in adding some flair to your language. Very quickly, the reflective writing, we know, again, I'm focusing here on what we do know about Mod C. Reflective writing may indeed feature in your Mod C exam. I know your teachers, and I know you've done it for an assessment, focusing upon explaining your own writing. So be really intentional, Year 12, in having a clarity around your purpose. As I said, you're now explaining your writing. You are the writer. Imagining you coming to my classroom and telling my students about your piece of writing. So tell them about the purpose, why you wrote it. Tell them about the audience, who you were writing it for. The ideas and the language features that you really focused on in your writing. You should be able to explain that because this is your writing. So be really clear in connecting that, hopefully to the Mod C prescribed text that you've drawn from. Make those links very obvious and plan this writing. You know that that's a strong possibility. Quote from your own writing. Now that's a little bit tricky until you've written it, but practice and be really clear that in your exam you're quoting yourself and your own writing. So don't worry about quoting the other Mod C text. It's your writing that you're quoting and explaining and analysing. And then explain the meaning. Why, as a writer, did you use that language? Why did you structure your writing like that? And tell us why you've done that. It's a really important thing to practice before your exam. Okay, very quick strategies, and I'm conscious of time. There's so much in Mod C, obviously, and it's so different to your other modules. Time management is obviously critical to your success in all of your exam responses, so be really careful of that. And I remind you, so commonly students come out from those exams telling us as teachers they didn't complete the exam. Now, don't do that Be really, really aware of your timing, 40 minutes for each response in paper 2. And again, conscious of your breakdown of your marks. If you're given a choice of writing style, choose wisely. Most students will just lean naturally towards imaginative, which I say to my classes is not always the best choice for you as an individual writer. If you know you're not a great creative writer, if you know you're not just a naturally creative person, maybe imaginative writing is not your best suit. Play your best cards here. This is one last response that you're writing for Mod C. So think about what's your best option if you are given the choice. Plan your writing. Always in an exam, the better you plan, the better you write. So take 5 minutes, take some time to really deconstruct and think about what you're being asked to write and respond to. Create a mind map, perhaps, stimulus, break it up, write all over your exam paper. And if you're unsure how to end your writing, or even how to open your writing, think about maybe some elements that you've got on that mind map, maybe some motifs or some symbols or a scene that you can come back to. And again, the link between an opening and a closing is a really basic but quite effective feature of writing that you might be able to use in your exam. Some sample questions. I just really want to quickly go through some good examples here. And again, I'm conscious that some of your classes will have already done this. So if you've done it in detail, you can kind of skip through. But ultimately, you've got some examples here that you might be able to pause and process a little bit further. This was the 2019 HSC exam, a Module C question, and you can see that was the exam paper. It had a large image, and you were directed as a student to create a piece of imaginative, discursive, or persuasive writing that ends with the provided image. The other part was obviously for 8 marks, part B. You had to explain how your study of the craft of writing enabled you to create an engaging piece of writing. Now, really importantly, there's one of those examples where you're given a choice, and here it's the ending. So be conscious in your writing, Year 12, that you may not write a complete piece of writing. You may be directed just to write a section of a piece of writing, an excerpt. So don't think that you've got to jam a whole narrative in if you're just directed to an ending. Be clear in what the question's asking you to address, all right? That image was a great image. And I know in talking to lots of students, there was all sorts of cliched kind of murders in the alleyways and drug deals that had gone wrong and those kind of very natural kind of associations with alleyways. Just maybe avoid just the first thing that comes to your mind. Don't be haphazard, but really intentional in what you can craft through that particular stimulus. Here, I want you thinking a little curveball strategy here. Maybe when you've got a part B here, I want you to actually think about your part B before you plow on in and start writing your part A. That's just a strategy from my perspective that works. But if you're asked to respond and explain your writing in 8 marks, you want to make sure you've got some good language and some good examples to reflect upon. So the reason I say think about it, you're not writing it obviously before you write the creative element, but be conscious of it. Be very intentional in what are some language features that I'm going to focus on in this piece of writing, and have that clarity in your mind before you just start writing your creative piece. It makes that process far less onerous when you're under exam pressure. Again, when you're breaking down the image, think about where it could be, who could be there, what character could be doing something in that particular image, how did they end up there, what's the mood of that image, what's the point of view that you could focus upon. Again, are you going to go down a literal interpretation, or can you be metaphorical and symbolic in the way that you're interpreting it? And I want to quickly look at some different examples of different approaches here. Discursively, if you were choosing to write persuasive discursively, and I've kind of clustered those together here, you've got some examples there on the screen that maybe you could have adapted and used that stimulus for, and you'll see immediately how broad those are. Using that image as a metaphor for the choices in life, as soon as you see a pathway, you know that there's this journey. Perhaps. It doesn't have to be a literal alleyway. It could be just a focus upon that path and that journey to a choice. So again, it might be something about the colour, the boldness and the brightness of those colours might be something you focus on in your writing. Again, it could be something to do with creativity. You've got an extensive use of the street art. You could really adapt and use that anyway. So again, look at some of those examples. Don't always just go to the literal and the obvious. I've got there an example from the 2019 exam. You can see that's a student response. And again, you might just want to pause and have a quick look at that. It's just an excerpt. It's not the whole piece. I've actually got two of them. So there's another one that, again, if you're interested, you might see the type of writing. It's always good to look at what other students have written and how they've responded to that particular question under exam pressure. Imaginative. If you were choosing to do an imaginative piece here, if you go down that option, again, don't necessarily be literal. I just mentioned about the cliched, obvious kind of endings that alleyway image might evoke. Try to think outside of that square, because if that's the first thing you've thought of, perhaps thousands of other students have thought of that as well straight away. And you don't want to be the same as everyone else. You want to kind of show your Mod C uniqueness and something very different in your writing to heaps of other students. So again, think about the alleyway, think about maybe a character or a narrative exploring the pressures of life perhaps, or finding light at the end of a tunnel, feeling trapped and closed in. I know lots of my students explore some of mental health through characterization in their writing. The focus on the girl there, maybe as a character. Who is that girl? And what is she significant? Maybe ending with some focus upon her staring out into the future or looking out to the horizon, whatever it is. The graffiti, who might have painted those images, a character, who is at the end of the alleyway? Who can you imagine being there? And again, what's happening in those buildings? There's characters perhaps that live in those buildings, and how can you craft something around that? You don't have to just be so obvious in your interpretation of a stimulus. There's a student example. Again, if you're interested, you can pause the video and read through that. I'm not going to read it for you, but ultimately, again, you can see there an example of a student writing in response to this particular question. The reflection, again, a very important element here in the Mod C, the reflection of the writing, and there again is that student who has reflected on his own or her own piece of writing, and it's just an example for you to consider here. This one I've chosen intentionally, and I'm not far from finishing Year 12, so I just want to, this is a NESA Mod C example. I always like looking at what NESA has given us as examples, and this one was an interesting one they gave us before the first Mod C exam. And the instructions there are two parts again, breaking it to 10 marks each. Use the image to write creatively about a character's response to entering this unfamiliar setting, and assess how effectively you evoked. Again, you're explaining there your writing. So how would you use that image, and how would you make that image work for something that you have crafted perhaps, and something that you have written? Now I draw your attention there to the word creatively. There's no direction to what style of writing you need to use there. So I would imagine, no pun intended, that most students would choose an imaginative piece of writing looking at that image. That would be my guess. And again, I've got here an example of a student piece of writing in response to that particular image and that task. So you can see there the focus in this student writing is obviously on describing that image, describing the character's feelings, which is ultimately what the question is directing you to do, and also obviously varying some language and some structure. There's the explanation by that student. Again, this is just a practice. It wasn't an exam. It was just a NESA sample. So you can have a look at that student writing. Now I'm going to throw a big curveball just to finish very quickly around the notion of a hybrid response. And I'm sure some of your teachers have spoken about hybrid responses, but ultimately it's where you're actually blending some of the styles. And the most obvious blending comes between the imaginative and the discursive styles of writing. So what I'm saying is you can actually use elements of both of those styles. And as I remember, a really important thing is don't ever label your piece of writing. So if you're given the option, don't tell a marker this is an imaginative piece at the top of your exam booklet. Just write it. Don't say persuasive. You can explain that in your explanation, but if you label your writing at the top of your exam booklet, a marker has to mark with that style in mind. Now, why that's significant is if you tell me it's a persuasive writing at the top of your exam booklet and it's not a great persuasive piece, I'm kind of stuck to mark it the way that you've told me it's meant to be. So just leave it open to interpretation. Ambiguity is great, and English teachers love the unknown and making us think. So why I'm saying a hybrid response here, maybe you don't have to write a narrative or an imaginative piece for this image. You could actually maybe describe it and then craft into some of your discursive writing that you've crafted. You know, maybe it's this familiar environment that you're in. Maybe it's an anecdote of going somewhere that was really opulent or really made you feel uncomfortable perhaps. Now that doesn't have to be that particular place. It could just be that you were walking upstairs, maybe, I don't know, depending on your piece of writing. But ultimately start and then blend some of those experiences. So yes, describe some of that image as you would if it was an imaginative, but then maybe bringing in some personal anecdotes and exploring a topic that you've already written about in your discursive or persuasive writing. Don't feel like you've got to do one or others. You can kind of blend those elements, and I've got some examples there on the screen for you to consider if that's the case. That leads into the final slide. Second final slide, around last year's HSC question. And the reason I wanted to finish there is obviously that's the closest indication we've got from the Mod C exams in the past. And you can see there the direction. Compose a piece of imaginative writing that is set in a significant place. Now I know as soon as the students read the imaginative, most students just wrote a narrative-based piece. Now that's really sad if you weren't a great imaginative writer and all of a sudden you're kind of stuck in that particular style. And I know I had some students last year who had crafted such excellent pieces of particularly discursive writing, and I fear that they didn't write those pieces. Now, be conscious that imaginative writing, as I mentioned before, does not have to be narrative. As you can see there, I've re-put the definition by Nessa. Imaginative writing simply represents ideas, feelings, and mental images in words or visual images. So what you're doing there is your discursive writing could still work if you focus on feelings and images. All right. So the focus there upon place is important, so you had to address that, but don't feel like you have to abandon what you've crafted year 12. This is part of you on a page, and we want to see the best that you can do. The other thing is you've got obviously an opening quote there that you didn't have to rewrite, but you had to acknowledge and use. So that was your stimulus here, all right? And again, no explanation. So there was no direction to explain here, and some students still wanted to do that. Don't do that, but ultimately your language should still be so obvious. Your choices as a writer should have been so clear that a marker could see them without you even telling them, okay? So that's how important your language is here. So be very conscious of that in your writing. Final things before I let you go and wish you all the best. Final things before that you can do right now as a final kind of lead in to your exam for Mod C. Practice writing. Practice different styles of writing, practice continuing excerpts, narratives, adopting different characters, mood paragraphs as I mentioned, all of those things. Focus on engaging openings and effective endings. Just keep writing year 12. It's so important to keep flexing those writing muscles and get better and better at it, and maybe hopefully you can then remember something that you've written and go, I can use that here when you read the question. Keep testing your writing against different stimulus for Mod C. Practice adapting and integrating the different stimulus in different questions. And keep deconstructing those, planning them, and making sure if you need more practice, your teachers have an abundance of them. So email your teachers or contact us and we can give you more practice for stimulus for Mod C. Planning is essential. And that's true of all your HSC responses, but it's critical in Mod C writing. And remember, Mod C is worth the equivalent of your other modules, so you want to make sure you get as many of these 20 marks as possible. Ensure you're conscious of intentional crafting of language. Be very clear that that is the focus, your own use of language as a writer. So practice explaining your language because you know that might be one of the elements in your Mod C exam. Good luck, Year 12. Ultimately, Mod C is a little bit of an anomaly. It's a little bit different, but it's a great module. So I really want you to take on board some of those tips, some of those strategies, and hopefully you feel more prepared and more confident going into that Mod C exam response. All the very best.